What has been done to rectify the damage to the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear facility 6 years after the disastrous meltdowns? What have been the medical impacts of the radioactive fallout that continues to be leached into the atmosphere and ocean? What would guide Japanese authorities to understate and even lie about the risks posed by the ongoing health impact? What role does Canada have in enabling the nuclear arms race? What does the rise of Donald Trump to the Oval Office and a newly inflamed Cold War mean in the midst of a still nuclear-armed Russia and America? This week, physician, author, and renowned anti-nuclear activist Helen Caldicott shares her thoughts with the Global Research NewsHour about the nuclear industry and its impacts 6 years after the greatest nuclear disaster of all time. On this week's program, Fukushima, Trump, and the prospects for humanity. A conversation with Helen Caldicott. Bringing you the analysis beyond the media headlines, the Global Research News Hour is on the air. Welcome to the Global Research News Hour for the week of March 10th, 2017. I'm series host and producer Michael Welch. Dr. Helen Caldicott is the founding president of Physicians for Social Responsibility and a legendary crusader against the nuclear power and weapons industries. She was named one of Smithsonian Institute's most influential women of the 20th century. She's president of the Helen Caldicott Foundation, which informs the public of the dangers of nuclear power and nuclear war. She's authored or edited several books, including Nuclear Madness, What You Can Do in 1979, If You Love This Planet, A Plan to Heal the Earth in 1992, The New Nuclear Danger, George W. Bush's Military-Industrial Complex in 2001, and her latest, Crisis Without End, The Medical and Ecological Consequences of the Fukushima Nuclear Catastrophe. She joins us now from Australia. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Caldicott.
That's a pleasure, Michael.
Okay, I'm wondering if I feel inclined to start with some of the most recent news that's come out. Just in the last month, there was a discovery of the highest ever radiation levels registered, 530 sieverts from the core of Unit 2. And there was also a metal grate underneath the main vessel that had a 2-meter hole in it. I was wondering if you could maybe just enlighten us on what we should draw and what we should not draw from that finding that was reported last month.
Okay, well, it only means that the robot got closer than ever before to the molten nuclear core. If it had got any closer, it would have measured higher readings than that. The readings are so high that if a man stood at that level of radiation near the core, he'd die very quickly, within minutes. But it didn't actually reach the core, so it means there are, it's much higher where the core is, number one. Number two, yes, there's a hole in the grate, and almost certainly the core melted through the concrete floor as well as the metal grate into the earth. That's where we think that molten core of about 100 tons of seethingly hot uranium with all its fission products, etc., is. The robot itself was destroyed at those radiation readings, so it's unlikely they'll ever get another robot nearer to the core. So the readings haven't gone up. All it means is that we've been able to access the core more closely than ever before.
Okay. So it's not a spike. I mean, it's likely it's just been that high all along for the last
Correct.
6 years.
Absolutely correct. But it indicates what an extraordinary situation we have, where there are 3 molten cores that have melted their way through the reactor container vessels almost certainly and into the earth. And they're being washed over by huge amounts of water all the time consistently. And about 300 to 400 tons of radioactive water has poured into the Pacific Ocean every day since the accident 6 years ago. the fact is that I predict, and from talking to nuclear engineers, reading the literature, that they will never be able to get those cores back, remediate them, or decommission the reactors, and that this will remain in perpetuity, polluting the Pacific Ocean forevermore. Number one. Number two, if there's an earthquake greater than 7 on the Richter scale, Building 2 we know has been damaged and destabilised by the earthquake. The robot saw that. But the other buildings are also damaged. And if there was an earthquake greater than 7 on the Richter scale, 1 or 2 of those buildings could collapse onto the molten cores, producing maybe a fire, nuclear fire, I don't know, but certainly spreading huge amounts of radiation into the atmosphere, making maybe parts of Japan or all of it uninhabitable, and producing tremendous danger for the northern hemisphere as the cloud wafts from west to east around the northern hemisphere. Also, there are over 1,000 huge tanks containing extremely radioactive water, which is not the water that's going to the Pacific. It's water that is being poured constantly into those 3 reactors to keep the cores cool still. And it's being extracted. It's seawater. It's being extracted, and it's very, very radioactive, and it's being stored in these huge tanks, which are only built to last for about 5 years. And if there's an earthquake greater than 7 on the Richter scale, those tanks, I don't know, all of them, some of them, few of them, could burst and release that water also into the Pacific Ocean. Number 3, they're running out of room to put any more tanks as they get more and more radioactive water. And they're now saying, well, maybe the obvious solution is just to pour the water into the Pacific. Number 4, they are treating some of this water to remove some of the contaminants like strontium-90 and cesium-137, but there are over 100 radioactive elements. Not all of them are being removed, and also the system doesn't work very well. I don't know if they are really removing many of them, and what do they do with the filters which are then contaminated, having filtered out these radioactive isotopes. And also they can't filter out tritium, which is extremely toxic, which biomagnifies in the food chain by orders of magnitude at each step. And tritium is extremely radiotoxic and extremely carcinogenic. So we're facing a situation which is intolerable, irreparable really, I think. And the 5th point to make is that they're continually injecting nitrogen gas into those 3 reactors because hydrogen is still being formed by the zirconium cladding of the fuel rods reacting with air. And as we know, we had 3 hydrogen explosions, or maybe 4.
That's what caused the structures to weaken, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and so they're diluting the hydrogen with nitrogen continuously to prevent another hydrogen explosion. So, every which way you look at the situation, it's an absolute total disaster.
So if they stop pumping in the nitrogen oxide, then it's just you're at risk of another, probably inevitably there will be another hydrogen explosion?
Well, that's what they think.
Because you're continually deliberately applying water there, but the water isn't just coming from what they're deliberately spraying onto the core to cool it, right?
No, they built the 6 reactors in front of a mountain range. The reactors are at sea level because they excavated a huge cliff so that they can put the reactors at sea level. But the mountain range is a problem because huge amounts of water wash down continuously from the mountains into the sea. Now, when the reactors were intact, the water flowed underneath the reactors into the sea and it wasn't a problem. But now, because of the damage that's been done and the fact that those 3 cores are now exposed to the mountainous water that's pouring into the Pacific continuously, that water becomes intensely radioactive as it flows over and mixes with the cores and takes out many of the radioactive elements in the core and flows into the sea. Now, they thought, well, I'll put a wall of ice, and so they injected these refrigerated cores into the earth and tried to freeze the earth to prevent the water from flowing under the reactor cores and bypassing the reactors. But, of course, it didn't work, number one. And number two, you'd have to have a continuous supply of electricity for the rest of time to maintain the wall, or it would melt. And number three, how do you generate electricity? By coal, increasing global warming, by natural gas, increasing global warming, or by nuclear power. And most of the reactors are closed down now anyway in Japan. Now, there is a nuclear engineer who's had another idea, and that is to build a very substantial wall of rock, cement, you name it, instead of the refrigeration wall. And so the water pours down from the mountains and then bypasses the reactors on both sides. It's diverted into pipes that flow into the Pacific. That has not been done. The Japanese are very proud, and they, until recently, didn't ask for any international help from some of the, the best brains in the world dealing with this situation. And they're now reaching out to ask for some help. I don't know if that wall would solve anything, but it's one solution that has been suggested that might possibly help the situation.
What about going back to the reactors? There's also the spent fuel pools. That's the repositories where all of the expired fuel is put, and it's all also on a high, like above the well above the ground. It's in these special reactors, and it's still quite radioactive, but they don't have that coolant. They're not able to keep them cool. And so I'm wondering...
Well, that's a good point, Michael. And I don't remember exactly how many spent fuel assemblies are in each pool. The pool is about 10 stories above ground level, high on the roof of those damaged reactors. Number 4, all the rods were removed from that fuel pool. So that has no rods and it has no radiation in the core. That's all been taken out. But 1, 2, and 3 still have enormous amounts of highly radioactive spent fuel in their pools. And so, of course, they would collapse too if there were another earthquake which caused the building to collapse. Yes, they could burn if exposed to air. Yes, they have to be continually cooled with water. And, they need 4,000 to 6,000 bodies per day, every day, to maintain an element of safety and piping and all sorts of things. And they're running out of warm bodies. The Yakuza, who is the Japanese mafia, has always been associated with the nuclear industry in Japan, apparently, and they're recruiting homeless people from the streets in Tokyo, etc., mentally deranged people, alcoholics, addicts, you name it, to get more humans there to work the system. Well, the other thing is that those people who go there, many of them are getting really high doses of radiation, and then, of course, they have to be dismissed. I don't think they're looked after. Some have already developed cancers and also leukemia as a result of the radiation, but that's going to happen more and more and more. And you know that they're going to run out of people to maintain any sort of normality, if one can use that word, at that very, very dangerous reactor plant.
That's a bit... I don't think too many people are aware of that the Japanese mafia is pulling people off the streets, like homeless people drug addicted and so on. What are those people doing on this site? I mean, you would think they probably wouldn't...
They put them in their radiation protective suits, which don't protect them. The only thing that can stop gamma radiation and neutron radiation entering the body is lead. And in fact, lead doesn't stop neutrons. And there are focuses of neutrons at certain areas in that reactor complex. But they're not being, their suits are made of paper and plastic. The radiation just goes straight through them. They look okay, but they're not. They've got respirators, some of them, although it gets too hot sometimes to wear the respirators because there is radiation in the air to be inhaled. The other important thing to note is that the medical profession has allied with the International Atomic Energy Agency in Fukushima, and at the Fukushima hospital they've built a new cancer hospital, which really tells you everything. They are only looking for thyroid cancer. Now, when Chernobyl occurred, thyroid cancer started appearing 2 years after the accident, and they're still occurring now. Leukemia tends to start occurring, which is cancer of the white blood cells, 5 to 10 years after being exposed to radiation. And solid cancers don't start appearing generally until 15 years later, and their incubation time is anything from, 2 to 80 years, and you don't know when the cancer develops, whether it was caused by radiation or not. The only way to determine that is to take the exposed population epidemiologically and measure the numbers of cancers and compare them to a non-exposed population. However, they've already been looking at thyroids of children who were under the age of 18 at the time of the accident, and they've found about 172 or maybe it's 183 thyroid cancers in these children. They haven't looked at all of them yet. Some of these cancers have metastasized to lymph glands, the lung, etc. The normal incidence in that population of children under the age of 18 is 1 or 2 per million. So we're seeing a huge spike in thyroid cancer, which is an indicator that we will soon be seeing a huge spike in leukemia and other cancers. Remember that children are 10 to 20 times more radiosensitive than adults, little girls twice as sensitive as little boys, fetuses thousands of times more so. Women are twice as sensitive as men for some reason that we don't understand. But it indicates that it's the tip of the iceberg and that we will be seeing many, many more cancers over time. However, the Japanese medical system such that is not looking at any other cancers, and the doctors have been told not to tell their patients that their symptoms, whether it's nose bleeding or loss of hair or whatever, could be related to radiation. And if they do, the government stops paying them. The Prime Minister Abe has passed a law to say that any reporters that report honesty on this situation could be jailed for 10 years. So there's a huge, massive cover-up. And they call it the nuclear village in Japan. TEPCO, Tokyo Electric Power Company, and Toshiba really are one and the same with the Japanese government. So the government is passing laws to protect the nuclear industry, not to protect the people. And this is an absolute medical catastrophe, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Now, there are a number of different agents by which radiation is coming in touch with the people. I guess one would be through the air, the atmosphere, what's been vented out of the facilities, what's going into the water, and also presumably through the things that people ingest. What would be the primary agent for people living?
Okay, well, there are many ways radiation can enter the body. First, when the meltdowns, the very, very short-lived isotopes that only last seconds are very high gamma radiation emitters. Gamma radiation is like X-rays. It goes straight through your body. You don't become radioactive when you've been exposed to gamma radiation, like you don't become radioactive when you're exposed to X-rays. But in the instant that you are exposed, regulatory genes can be mutated in cells, and later the cell might divide uncontrollably, and that's a cancer. Fukushima Prefecture is a very fertile area, and it grows wonderful food, peach peaches and plums and rice and all sorts of stuff, and milk and cattle farms and the like. Most of the Fukushima prefecture is quite highly contaminated, especially the dams and the rivers and the creeks, because the water flies down from the mountains and brings with it radioactive contaminants which get into the water. The rice is contaminated, much of it, and so they're diluting it with uncontaminated rice. The solution to pollution by dilution when it comes to radiation is fallacious, because the radioactive elements reconcentrate back in the body. They're looking mostly only at cesium-137 and 134. Cesium is a potassium analogue, and it resembles potassium in the body. The body thinks it's potassium. Potassium is highly concentrated in all cells of the body, but particularly cesium tends to go to the endocrine glands, thyroid, pancreas, adrenals and the like, and to cardiac muscle. And we've noted that in the Chernobyl survivors, quite a lot of people are having sudden heart attacks, including children, because of the radiation in the cardiac muscle. Cesium-137, its half-life is 28 years. I think that's right. Cesium-134, which is more radioactive, its half-life is about 2.5 years. You multiply a half-life by 10 to get its total radiological life. So cesium can cause brain tumours and cancers of the endocrine glands, including thyroid, heart attacks, and ovarian cancer and the like. Then there's strontium-90, which is a calcium analogue. Its half-life is 28 years. Cesium-137, is about 30 years. So strontium-90 concentrates in bone, where it can irradiate cells to induce leukemia, cancer of the white blood cells that are made in the bone marrow, and also bone cancer. And it concentrates in milk, of course, and cesium concentrates, hundreds of times at each step of the food chain. For instance, in the sea, in the algae, then in the crustaceans, then the little fish, then the big fish, then us. And we stand at the apex of the food chain, and these elements concentrate most highly in us.
Yeah, you're talking about biomagnification, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
That's whole, yeah, of course, where people may be familiar with it, with the whole DDT issue, or
Well, what I would say to people is do not go to Japan. Do not, under any circumstances, take your children to Japan, because you don't know what you're eating and where the food is sourced. And do not buy Japanese food. Don't buy miso, fish, rice, you name it. Do not buy and eat Japanese food, because you don't know where it's coming from. And the Japanese are trying now to export their radioactive food to London and elsewhere. Taiwan has refused to receive it. But it's dangerous, and it's going to continue to be dangerous for the rest of time. It's sad.
You said about not going to Japan. That's where the Olympics of 2020 are taking place, and apparently the president had made a successful bid to hold the Olympics there, arguing that they had dealt with the Fukushima disaster. Your thoughts about that?
He lied.
Mm-hmm.
And they're going to have some of the events near the Fukushima nuclear power plant. And those beautiful young bodies at the peak of their physical prowess are going to be exposed to radiation in the air, because the reactors are still emitting radiation into the air. They're going to be exposed to radiation in the food. And also on the ground level, there are areas in Tokyo where if you collect the soil from the road or the moss on the roof or the vacuum cleaner dust, these bits of dirt, etc., their radiation readings are so high that they would be subjected to being put into a radioactive waste dump in America. That's how high they are. And 35 million people live in Tokyo, and many of them being exposed to radiation as they inhale or in their food or as they walk around. I mean, the thing is disastrous. And the Japanese people, I've been there twice, they're desperate to know, desperate. And even if you tell them the truth, which is very scary, they're so grateful because they want to know the truth.
Yes, and could you comment on, because as I understand it, the Japanese government is no longer subsidizing the evacuees who left, so
Yeah.
that puts them in a very difficult situation. You either come back and face these hazards that you see, and apparently the government doesn't, or they sink or swim on their own for wherever they are.
Yeah, well, that's right. That's what's happening. They're removing the money for them to live outside the contaminated area. I mean, it's really evil what is happening, really evil.
Well, I was just going to ask, what are the incentives for the government I guess, is it willful blindness? Is this just we don't care how many people are going to die? Or what would be the incentive?
Sweeping the problem under the carpet, so to speak. They don't care, obviously, how many people are going to die. They don't even want to know about it, and they're pretending everything's normal so that they can get the nuclear industry up and running again. That's what it's about. And Japan is a very big player in the nuclear industry. Toshiba and other Mitsubishi and other huge corporations make parts for nuclear reactors and export them all over the world, to Saudi Arabia and to all sorts of places, including the containment vessel of reactors. And so they want to keep their export industry going. It's just to prop up the money. And the men, I don't think the men really care whether people live or die. It's a funny autocratic society where, people who are at the top maintain the power. It's an interesting society. But, America's just as bad. And Canada, you live in a place where you export uranium all over the world. So do we in Australia. Your CANDU reactors make very, very pure plutonium. They are huge emitters of tritium into the air and water. Surveys have shown that children under the age of 5 who live within 5 kilometres of a reactor have double the incidence of leukemia, probably from tritium and carbon-14 that's extruded from the reactors, and they have a high incidence of solid cancers. You are really guilty that your uranium fueled the first nuclear weapons in the world, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You've exported your reactors all over the world so people can make nuclear weapons from them, including India and Pakistan and the like. You are guilty as hell. And Cameco in Canada should be hung, dried and quartered. I mean, you need to close your industry down. And also the uranium is mined in places where there are indigenous people, so it contaminates their food, their livestock, their lives. They die of cancer and leukemia. And there's very little publicity about what's going on in the nuclear industry in Canada.
Yeah, or in the world, for that matter, it seems to me.
Well, yeah, but I'm focusing now on Canada.
Fair enough.
And your new Prime Minister should be doing something about it. I actually met with Pierre Trudeau for an hour and a quarter over lunch in his prime ministerial residence. And after that conversation, he led the campaign for a 5-continent, 6-nation peace initiative. He was wonderful. And his son, I'm sure, could walk in his father's footsteps in the nuclear area.
Yeah, well, it does seem as if the Liberal government of Justin Trudeau is quite friendly, or seeking to be quite friendly with the nuclear industry, and so I mean,
Yes. It does. Well, therefore, you need to get onto his back. He's got young children who he loves. I got to Pierre Trudeau through his children, who he absolutely adored. I won't go into the whole interview, but if you read my book, A Desperate Passion, I describe the whole interview there with Trudeau. And also my film, If You Love This Planet, was made by the Canadian Film Board and won an Oscar for the best documentary.
Yes, National Film Board.
Played a big role in this, yes.
For sure. I wanted you to comment on the responsibleness of. I mean, you've got the nuclear regulatory authorities, both within Japan and internationally, as well as the World Health Association, the International Atomic Energy Agency. Given the urgency that you and Arnie Gunderson and others have been putting out there to try to get this message out, how would you evaluate the way they have responded to this clear and present danger in their actions and their...
Well, the nuclear regulators are only about one thing, and that's to keep the industry going. They're businessmen. They don't really care about health, and they obfuscate and cover up investigations and don't investigate. You know, the nuclear industry is a carcinogenic industry. They're cancer factories, those nuclear power plants. And if there's a war and a missile hits a nuclear power plant, it could contaminate. Oh no, if a 1 megaton bomb hits a nuclear power plant, it could contaminate an area the size of West Germany, I think, or Pennsylvania. I can't remember which one. But, you know, you can't have a war in country where there are nuclear reactors, although there are 15 in the Ukraine, including Chernobyl, and there's a war going on there. So that's very, very dangerous. The International Atomic Energy Agency in I think it was 58, got the WHO, World Health Organization, to sign an agreement that WHO would not investigate any nuclear accident from a health perspective unless it got permission from the IAEA. So they're hung, drawn and quartered. They're totally compromised. They've sold their soul, WHO, to, like Faust, to the devil. So, you know, we work so hard to try and save patients with cancer. My specialty is cystic fibrosis, the most common fatal genetic disease of childhood. There are over 2,600 such diseases. And what the nuclear waste will do is contaminate food chains, water supplies, human bodies, fetuses for the rest of time. And what we're doing is producing a derogatory effect upon the positive process of evolution, let alone inducing epidemics of cancer, leukemia, genetic disease, and deformed babies for the rest of time. Not forgetting that we are not the only ones with genes. All plants and animals have genes, and all can be mutated by radiation. It's an evil, wicked, malicious industry that kills people slowly over time.
I think another important point that to inform our listeners about is I think it's called teratogenesis. This idea that future generations are impacted by what happens to people who are exposed today, even if they move to some area that's radiation free. The impacts will multiply over time, right?
Okay, so teratogenesis means damage to the fetus in the first trimester.
Okay.
In the first 3 months of intrauterine life, the fetus develops all its organs, its limbs, and the like. After that, it just grows in size. Now, the placenta lets nothing through, really. It's very protective of the fetus. Viruses, etc., just don't get through. But, for instance, plutonium, which is so toxic that a millionth of a gram can give you lung cancer, it is an iron analog, so the body thinks it's iron. So it combines plutonium with transferrin, which is the iron transporting protein of the body, and plutonium actually crosses the placenta, and it behaves like the drug thalidomide. It will kill a cell that's going to form the left half of the brain or the eye or the right arm. And that's what happened when pregnant women took thalidomide to prevent morning sickness. Their babies were born without arms or legs or the like. It was dreadful. Now, there are hundreds of homes near Chernobyl full of the most damaged, deformed children. And we have never seen this in the history of pediatrics, and I'm a pediatrician. It's really dreadful. If you go to the New York Academy of Sciences, you can get a book from them called Chernobyl, where there are photographs of these very, very deformed children. And so, therefore, pregnant women who are exposed to radiation in the first trimester are likely to have deformed babies. It's kind of like the Zika virus, only that damages the brain. That's a dreadful thing too. That's a teratogenic virus. Now, the other thing to note is, of course, mutations in the eggs and sperm in the gonads. And so every person carries several hundred genes for disease. For instance, I'm a carrier for hemochromatosis, which is a recessive gene, and my ex-husband has it too, and so our eldest son, Philip, has hemochromatosis. It's rare. It only gets expressed if there are two genes together. Like, you can't have blue eyes unless you have two blue-eyed genes. If you have a brown-eyed gene and a blue-eyed gene, you're going to have brown eyes. Now, we all carry several hundred genes for disease, and that's because the genes in the eggs and sperm have been mutated over time, and we carry these genes for disease, and you don't know you carry them unless you mate with someone with the same abnormal gene. Well, increasing radiation in the environment for the rest of time is going to increase the number and incidence of these very, very bad genetic diseases in both plants, animals, and humans. So we're degrading the positive process of evolution.